Lucas had heard rumors about the old amusement park on the outskirts of town, long forgotten, shrouded in mystery. It was said to be cursed, abandoned after a string of tragic accidents. As a photographer with a thirst for urban decay, he couldn't resist the pull of its eerie allure. But as he approached the gates, something felt off. The air was unnaturally still, as if the park itself was holding its breath. The rusted iron gates creaked open with the slightest touch, inviting him into a world frozen in time. Beyond the gates, the overgrown paths wound through decaying rides and broken-down stalls, remnants of joy now twisted into grotesque shapes. The silence was oppressive, and every step Lucas took echoed in the vast emptiness, magnifying the sense of isolation. He was alone, or so he thought. In the distance, the Ferris wheel stood tall, its skeletal frame looming like a sentinel guarding dark secrets. Something about it was deeply unsettling. The cabins hung motionless in the mist, but Lucas could swear he saw movement, a slight rocking, as if someone or something was still inside. His heart pounded in his chest, the feeling of being watched growing with every passing second. He tried to shake it off, but the sensation lingered, crawling under his skin. The further he ventured into the park, the thicker the fog became, obscuring his view and distorting the once familiar shapes of the rides. The world around him felt wrong, as though reality itself was bending, warping into something unnatural. As Lucas approached the Ferris wheel, he noticed something strange, a faint sound, barely audible, like distant laughter. At first, it seemed harmless, just the echo of old memories. But then it grew louder, closer, taking on a sinister tone, as if mocking him. His breath quickened. The laughter morphed into whispers, indistinct but insistent, circling around him like invisible predators. He spun in place, searching for the source, but there was no one. Only the Ferris wheel, now swaying ever so slightly, its rusted metal groaning as if straining under some unseen force. Suddenly, without warning, the Ferris wheel creaked to life. The cabins, once still, began to move in slow, deliberate circles. Lucas froze, his pulse racing. There was no wind, no power to drive the mechanism, yet it spun, defying logic. He raised his camera instinctively, but his hands trembled as he snapped the shot. Through the lens, he saw something that made his blood run cold. A dark figure sitting in one of the cabins, its face obscured by shadows. He lowered the camera, blinking, but the figure was gone. Panic surged through him, his instincts screaming to leave, but something deeper, curiosity, dread, kept him rooted to the spot. The whispers intensified, swirling around his head, forming words that sent shivers down his spine. "Come closer," they beckoned. Lucas took a step back, but his foot hit something soft. He looked down and nearly screamed. At his feet lay a decayed teddy bear, its matted fur covered in dirt, its button eyes staring blankly up at him. A memory surged, unbidden and haunting. A toy just like this, one he had as a child. But how? He had never been to this place before, yet the sense of familiarity was overwhelming, as if the park had been waiting for him all along. The Ferris wheel groaned again, its movement now erratic, as though struggling against some invisible force. The fog thickened, swirling in unnatural patterns around the base of the ride, and Lucas felt a sudden, suffocating weight settle over him. His chest tightened, and for a moment he couldn't breathe. Something was watching him, something ancient and malevolent. He could feel its gaze boring into him from the shadows. The park wasn't just abandoned, it was alive, and it had been waiting for someone to stumble into its web. Suddenly, the laughter returned, louder and more deranged than before. The Ferris wheel spun faster, its cabins shaking violently as if trying to break free from their chains. Lucas backed away, fear gripping his throat. As he turned to run, he caught one last glimpse of the figure in the cabin, its face now twisted into a grotesque smile, eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. The whispers followed him as he fled, their words seeping into his mind like poison. "You can't escape, not now, not ever. As Lucas stumbled further into the depths of the abandoned park, his mind felt heavy with unease. The fog clung to him like a living thing, curling around his ankles and obscuring the path ahead. He stopped near a dilapidated carousel, its once colorful horses now cracked and weathered, their painted eyes hollow and lifeless. He couldn't shake the feeling that something in this place was trying to reach him, pulling memories from the dark corners of his mind. As he stood there, staring at the eerily still carousel, an image flashed before his eyes, his sister, Anna, standing in front of a ride much like this one. He hadn't thought about her in years. Lucas had always told himself he'd forgotten, buried the pain deep enough that it wouldn't resurface. But now, the memories were unraveling, clawing their way back to the surface. Anna had vanished when they were kids, taken during a family trip to a carnival. One moment she was beside him, and the next, she was gone, swallowed by the crowd, never to be seen again. They never found her, and Lucas had spent years trying to erase that day from his mind. But here, in the chilling silence of the park, it all came rushing back, sharper and more vivid than ever. The same rides, the same suffocating atmosphere. Had he been here before? His heart pounded as he noticed something lying on the ground, half buried in the dirt near the carousel. Kneeling, he brushed aside the debris, his fingers trembling as they closed around a small object. It was a bracelet, tarnished and broken, but unmistakably familiar. It was the one Anna had worn the day she disappeared, a cheap trinket they'd bought together. His pulse quickened as he stared at it, disbelief giving way to dread. How could this be here? His grip tightened on the bracelet, the cool metal biting into his skin. He felt a searing pain shoot up his arm, and when he looked down, the scar on his wrist, one he'd had since childhood, was throbbing, turning a deep, angry red. The air around him grew colder, and the fog seemed to thicken, coiling tighter. The past was reaching for him, merging with the present, and Lucas could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. The park wasn't just a coincidence. It was connected to him, to Anna. But how? His thoughts raced, but the more he tried to focus, the more fragmented they became. It was as if the park itself was playing with his mind, warping his sense of reality. Every shadow seemed to shift, every sound felt distorted. He heard the faint echo of a child's laughter, a sound that chilled him to the bone. He turned sharply, his eyes scanning the fog, but saw nothing. Just then, a familiar melody filled the air, haunting, distant. A song he hadn't heard in years, a lullaby his mother used to sing when they were children. The same song she had hummed as they walked through the carnival that day. His breath caught in his throat as the carousel began to turn, slowly creaking to life. The worn-out horses moved with a mechanical groan, their cracked mouths opening and closing as if trying to speak. But it was the music that unnerved him most. The lullaby played in a warped, distorted tone, the notes stretching unnaturally, twisting into something malevolent. The scar on his wrist burned fiercely, as though the past itself was carving its way out of him. He clutched his arm in pain, trying to calm his racing heart. But as the carousel turned, something caught his eye. One of the horses, its chipped paint and broken mane, looked familiar. Too familiar. In the dim light, he recognized it from an old photograph, one he had taken with Anna on their last day together. The horse was identical, down to the small scratch on its flank. His stomach twisted with fear. This couldn't be happening. How could the same horse from that distant carnival appear here, in this forsaken place? Lucas backed away, his mind spinning, but the memories were relentless. The bracelet in his hand, the scar on his wrist, the horse from the past. Everything was pointing to a terrible truth he wasn't ready to face. The fog seemed to close in tighter, suffocating him with the weight of forgotten years. He wasn't just in a park. He was in the very heart of his trauma. The past wasn't buried. It had been waiting for him all along, festering in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the lullaby continued, now twisted and otherworldly, Lucas saw something move out of the corner of his eye. A shadowy figure, small and distant, standing by the Ferris wheel. His blood ran cold. It was a child, standing perfectly still, its head tilted slightly to one side. He squinted through the fog, his heart racing. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. It just stared, its outline blurry in the thick mist. Then, slowly, it raised its hand, as if beckoning him. His breath caught in his throat as he recognized the gesture. It was exactly how Anna used to wave when they played hide-and-seek. A chilling realization washed over him. He wasn't just revisiting the past was alive, and it wanted him back. Lucas's pulse raced as he stood frozen, staring at the shadowy figure in the distance. The childlike silhouette by the Ferris wheel was unmoving, its arm raised in that hauntingly familiar gesture. His mind screamed at him to run, to flee this cursed place, but something held him in place. A magnetic pull, deep and primal. It wasn't just fear. It was something darker, something that gnawed at the very core of his being. As the fog swirled around him, distorting the world, he heard the voice again. A whisper, barely audible, but clear enough to send a shiver down his spine. "You must choose," it said, a voice that seemed to echo from every direction at once. Suddenly, the park shifted. The rides creaked. The air grew thick with tension, and Lucas felt an overwhelming pressure weighing down on him. The ground beneath him trembled, as if the earth itself was unsettled. He could feel it. This place was alive, feeding on his fear, his confusion. The figure by the Ferris wheel hadn't moved, but now it seemed closer, clearer. And then, in a blink, it wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was Anna, his sister, standing there as she had been all those years ago, her face expressionless, her eyes empty, staring straight through him. Lucas's chest tightened. This couldn't be real. His sister had disappeared. He'd spent years searching, grieving, trying to forget. But there she was, just as he remembered her, only now. There was something wrong. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her movements were unnatural, jerky, as if she were being controlled by invisible strings. "Tell me, Lucas," her voice came, soft and pleading. His heart lurched. Could it really be her? Or was this another cruel trick of the park? Then, without warning, the whispers returned, louder now, swirling around him like a storm. "You must choose save her or save yourself." The words clawed at his mind, pulling him in two directions. His hands trembled as he clutched the bracelet tighter, feeling its cold metal bite into his skin. The pain from the scar on his wrist was unbearable now, as if the past was physically tearing him apart. He took a step forward toward Anna, but stopped as the ground in front of him cracked open. From the darkness below, something else emerged, a figure, cloaked in shadows, its eyes burning with malice. The entity was unlike anything Lucas had ever seen. Its form shifted constantly, as if it were made of the very fabric of fear itself. It spoke without a mouth, its voice a guttural growl that echoed deep in his mind. "You cannot have both," it said. "You will sacrifice one, or you will lose everything." The weight of its presence crushed him, suffocating him in dread. The air around him grew cold, and his breath came in short, shallow gasps. This was the choice, an impossible one. Save his sister, or save himself. There was no escape, no way out of this nightmare. His mind raced, torn between the two options. The entity moved closer, its shape shifting and writhing, filling the air with the stench of decay. "If you save her," it hissed, "you will give up everything you know, everything you are. You will never leave this place." Lucas's heart pounded in his chest. If he chose Anna, he would be trapped here forever, bound to this cursed park. But how could he abandon her again? How could he walk away, knowing that she was still here, lost and alone? The entity continued, its voice low and venomous. "But if you leave her behind, you will live. You will escape this place, but she will suffer forever." Lucas felt his throat tighten. The very thought of leaving her here, to face this torment, was unbearable. Yet the fear of being trapped, of losing his own sanity, clawed at him just as fiercely. The figure of Anna stood motionless by the Ferris wheel, her face a mask of sadness, her eyes pleading with him in silence. As Lucas struggled with the decision, the fog seemed to close in around him, suffocating, thick with the weight of his impending choice. The park itself seemed to be watching, waiting for his next move. Every fiber of his being screamed in agony as he considered the consequences. He could feel the dark tendrils of the park reaching for him, promising madness, eternal entrapment. His memories of the real world, of his life outside this nightmare, began to fade, slipping away like grains of sand through his fingers. And then, as if sensing his hesitation, the entity offered him one final option, its voice dripping with malice. "Or you could take her place," it whispered. "Absorb the darkness yourself. Let her go free. But you will become part of the park, forever bound to this place, to the wheel, to the shadows. Her freedom for your soul." The world spun around him, his vision blurring with fear and desperation. The fog seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, and the ground trembled beneath his feet. The choice was his. Save his sister and lose himself. Leave her to suffer and save his own life. Or take the darkness into himself, allowing her to escape while condemning himself to an eternity of torment. The weight of the decision crushed him, every possible outcome a descent into terror. His mind teetered on the edge of sanity as he glanced between Anna, the Ferris wheel, and the entity looming before him. The whispers were deafening now, the park itself seeming to chant his doom, urging him to decide. There was no more time. Lucas had to choose, before the park made the choice for him. The atmosphere around Lucas thickened, as if the air itself had become heavy and oppressive. The fog twisted and coiled unnaturally, wrapping around him like cold fingers reaching from the shadows. Every step he took seemed to disturb the stillness of the park, as if he were trespassing on sacred ground long forgotten. The rides, once silent and decaying, now creaked faintly, their rusted metal groaning as if they were alive, watching, waiting. There was something here, something hidden just beyond the veil of reality. It felt as though the park itself was aware of him, sentient and malevolent, breathing with an unseen life that he couldn't fully comprehend. As Lucas moved, the whispers returned, no longer distant, but closer, too close. They circled around him like a storm of voices, some soft and beckoning, others guttural and cruel. The voices spoke in fragments, phrases that made no sense, yet each word sent a chill through his body. "Come closer. Don't you remember? It's not over yet. She's waiting for you." The whispers seemed to emanate from the very shadows that crept along the edges of his vision. He spun around, expecting to see someone or something lurking behind him, but there was nothing. Only the twisting fog and the ever-present silhouette of the Ferris wheel looming in the distance. The shadows themselves seemed to move, stretching unnaturally along the ground, slithering like serpents, as though they were alive. They flickered at the edge of his perception, always just out of reach, disappearing the moment he tried to focus on them. His heartbeat quickened as he realized the park was no longer just a backdrop for his nightmare. It had come alive, feeding off his fear. The old wooden roller coaster groaned, its beams cracking as though something heavy had walked across them. But when he turned, the ride stood as silent and abandoned as before. The ground beneath his feet felt unstable, shifting slightly as if it were breathing, pulsing with the life of something buried deep within. Lucas tried to steady his mind, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. He covered his ears, but the voices were inside his head now, crawling through his thoughts like a parasite. "You don't belong here," one voice snarled, low and filled with malice. Another voice, softer, almost like a child's, whispered, "But you've always been here, haven't you?" The sensation of being watched intensified. It was no longer just a vague feeling. He knew something was watching him, something just beyond the veil of reality, hidden within the park's dark heart. Every shadow seemed to ripple with its presence, and each rustle of the wind felt like a breath on the back of his neck. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and a strange, unnatural silence fell over the park. The creaks and groans of the ride stopped, the wind died, and even the distant sounds of the Ferris wheel ceased. The only noise was the frantic beating of Lucas's heart, loud and desperate in the suffocating quiet. He took a hesitant step forward, and the ground beneath him seemed to shift, as if something was moving just beneath the surface. He stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The fog began to swirl around him in unnatural patterns, coalescing into shapes, vague, humanoid forms that flickered in and out of existence. One of the shadowy figures seemed to materialize in front of him, just for a moment. It was tall and gaunt, its form twisted and flickering like a dying flame. Its face was featureless, a blank, shifting void where eyes and mouth should have been. Lucas blinked, and the figure was gone, swallowed back into the fog. But the sensation it left behind lingered, a cold, gnawing dread that clung to him like the fog itself. His pulse quickened, the overwhelming urge to flee almost too much to resist. But where will he go? There was no escape. The park was a labyrinth of shadows and memories, and now it was closing in around him. Then, from the darkness, came a sound, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like fingers drumming on wood. Lucas turned toward the source, his breath caught in his throat. There, standing by the old ticket booth, was a figure, a woman, or what looked like one, her form draped in shadow. Her long, dark hair hung over her face, obscuring her features, but something about her was all too familiar. She raised her hand slowly, tapping her fingers on the wooden counter in a deliberate, mocking rhythm. Lucas's blood ran cold. He recognized that gesture. It was exactly how his sister used to tap her fingers when she was anxious. His heart pounded in his chest as he took a step closer, squinting to see through the thick fog. "Anna," he whispered, his voice trembling, but the figure didn't respond. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if studying him, her hair still covering her face. Then, slowly, she raised her hand and pointed to the Ferris wheel, her finger trembling as if she were forcing herself to do it. Lucas's throat tightened as he followed her gaze. The Ferris wheel, once still, was moving again, the cabin swaying gently as it turned, impossibly slow, like the ticking of a great, ancient clock. The woman by the ticket booth let out a soft, eerie laugh, a sound that seemed to echo unnaturally through the park, as if the very ground beneath him were laughing along with her. Lucas staggered back, his mind reeling. The shadows were no longer just passive observers. They were active, manipulating his thoughts, his memories, twisting reality around him. Every corner of the park seemed to pulse with unseen life, every darkened space hiding something sinister, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The whispers swirled around him, louder now, their voices blending together into an unintelligible cacophony of dread. "You cannot escape. She's waiting for you. This is where it ends." His body felt heavy, as though the park itself was trying to pull him under, drag him into the shadows where he would never be found. And yet he couldn't stop. Something, whether it was the whispers, the shadowy figure, or his own guilt, was pushing him toward the Ferris wheel, toward whatever nightmare awaited him there. The further Lucas ventured into the park, the more his grip on reality began to slip. The fog wrapped tighter around him, distorting his vision, making it impossible to tell what was real and what was just a figment of his increasingly fragile mind. His breath came in shallow, ragged bursts as the eerie silence of the park weighed on him like a physical force. Every creak of an old ride, every rustle of the wind, sounded amplified, like the park was whispering directly to his soul. The shadows had become his constant companions, shifting and twitching at the corners of his vision, vanishing when he turned his head, but always there, lurking. Then the visions began. At first, they were small, a fleeting glimpse of movement out of the corner of his eye, a dark silhouette standing just outside the light of the lampposts. But as he continued walking, the hallucinations grew bolder. The fog thickened, and shapes began to form within it, indistinct at first, but then growing sharper, clearer. Faces, contorted in terror, floated just beyond his reach, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes locked on him with pleading desperation. His heartbeat quickened, his skin prickling with a cold sweat. The faces in the mist were familiar, far too familiar. Friends, family, people he knew, people he had lost. He rubbed his eyes, trying to shake the images, but they wouldn't go away. Worse, they seemed to follow him, closing in as he stumbled through the decaying park. His mind began to betray him, showing him things he knew couldn't be real. He saw Anna again, standing just a few feet ahead of him, her face pale and twisted with pain, her eyes wide with fear. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice like the rustle of dead leaves. "You have to help me, before it's too late." But something wasn't right. Her voice, though familiar, was hollow, lacking the warmth and life he remembered. There was something off about the way she stood, the way her body seemed to sway with the mist as if she wasn't fully there. The scar on his wrist burned again, the searing pain pulling him back into his own body, grounding him in the nightmare that was unfolding around him. This wasn't Anna. It couldn't be. He took a step back, but the figure of his sister remained, her eyes filled with that same desperate plea. As he backed away, the park around him seemed to shift and breathe, as if the very ground was alive, feeding on his fear. The shadows grew darker, longer, creeping toward him like hungry beasts. Lucas could hear whispers again, not just from the shadows, but from inside his own mind. They hissed, sharp and venomous, taunting him with his worst fears. "She's gone because of you," one whispered, a voice that sounded too much like his own thoughts. "You left her. You failed her." The words struck deep, cutting into his psyche, and Lucas felt his resolve begin to crumble. His knees wobbled, and the weight of the park, the whispers, the faces in the mist, it was all too much. His mind was cracking under the pressure, the thin line between reality and illusion dissolving into nothing. He saw more visions now, more twisted versions of his past, his mother's disappointed face, his father's cold silence. People he had lost over the years, all accusing him, their voices blending with the park's whispers. His failures, his regrets, his darkest thoughts, they all rose to the surface, raw and unrelenting. The Ferris wheel in the distance groaned, its rusted joints creaking as it spun slowly, mockingly, as if it were laughing at him. The sound of its turning was like nails on a chalkboard, grating against his nerves. He couldn't take it anymore. His hands trembled as he gripped the bracelet he had found, the one that once belonged to Anna. The metal felt cold and alien in his hand, a relic from a life that no longer seemed real. The fog swirled around him, and suddenly, the visions shifted. Now he saw himself, reflected in the broken windows of a nearby ride, his face pale and gaunt, eyes wide with terror. But it wasn't just a reflection. It was him, or rather, the version of him that the park had twisted into something monstrous. His reflection sneered at him, its eyes glowing with a malevolent hunger. "You're weak," it hissed. "You'll never escape this place. You'll never save her." The words sank deep into Lucas's mind, and for a moment he believed them. He could feel the park pulling him in, dragging him deeper into its nightmare. His vision blurred, and for a moment he thought he could hear the sound of the Ferris wheel turning inside his own mind, the creaking metal echoing through his skull. The shadows closed in tighter, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. "Give in," they hissed. "It's easier this way. You can end it all now." Lucas's thoughts spiraled as the park warped around him, the fog coalescing into monstrous shapes, the faces of the dead and the lost pressing in from every direction. His heart pounded in his chest, the weight of his fear crushing him. He felt the cold hand of the park's darkness reaching into his mind, twisting his memories, distorting his sense of self. Was this all real? Had he been here before? Was Anna really here? Or was she just another trick of the shadows? The temptation to give in, to let the darkness take him, was overwhelming. His body felt weak, his mind exhausted from the relentless terror. But somewhere, deep inside, A flicker of resistance remained. He had come here for a reason. He had to find Anna, had to save her, even if it cost him his sanity. The fear gnawed at him, threatened to consume him whole, but he couldn't let it win. Not yet. With a shaky breath, Lucas forced himself to move forward, deeper into the fog, deeper into the heart of the park's darkness. The whispers followed, relentless. The faces in the mist watching, waiting. And as he walked, the Ferris wheel continued to turn. Its slow, grinding spin a constant reminder of the ticking clock, of the fear that would never let him go. The fog seemed to tighten its grip around Lucas as he approached the Ferris wheel. The air was thick, suffocating, and each step felt like it took more of his strength, draining his resolve. The monstrous shape of the Ferris wheel towered above him, its eerie silhouette cutting through the mist like the blade of a guillotine. The cabins creaked and swayed, moving with an unnatural rhythm, as though something unseen was pushing them from within. Lucas's pulse quickened, a cold sweat forming on the back of his neck. This was it, the place where the answers lay, where everything had begun, and where it might all end. As he neared the base of the wheel, the whispers intensified, louder and more distinct now, their voices blending into a twisted harmony of anguish and despair. He could hear them clearer than ever before, not just in his mind, but all around him, filling the very air with their malice. "Come closer," they urged. "It's time." The Ferris wheel groaned, and Lucas felt the earth tremble beneath his feet as if the park itself was alive, pulsating with dark energy. The fog swirled faster, and the shadows seemed to press in tighter, watching, waiting. Suddenly, he saw her, Anna. She stood in front of the Ferris wheel, motionless, her pale face illuminated by the dim glow of the park's long-dead lights. Her hair hung limply over her face, her clothes torn and dirted, as if she had been trapped in this nightmare for years. She didn't speak, didn't move. She just stared at Lucas with those hollow, empty eyes, eyes that seemed devoid of life. His heart clenched in his chest. This wasn't the Anna he remembered. This was something else, something dark, something that had taken her place. "Anna," he whispered, his voice barely audible, trembling with fear and confusion. She didn't respond. Instead, her head tilted slightly, her eyes locking onto his with a cold, unnerving intensity. Then, slowly, she lifted her hand and pointed to the Ferris wheel, her fingers shaking as though the act was difficult, almost painful. "She's still in there," a voice whispered, but Lucas couldn't tell if it came from Anna or the shadows. "You must bring her back." Lucas's heart raced. What did they mean? Bring her back from where? His mind spun, desperately trying to make sense of madness. The Ferris wheel groaned again, its movement jerky and unnatural, as if it were straining under some invisible force. The cabins swayed violently, their windows dark and foreboding. One of them, higher up, seemed to glow faintly, an ominous light flickering from within. Without thinking, Lucas took a step toward the Ferris wheel. The whispers swarmed around him, louder now, more chaotic. "It's waiting for you," they hissed. "You can't leave without her." His feet felt heavy, like he was wading through thick mud, but he kept moving, drawn to the wheel by an unseen force. As he reached the base of the ride, he saw it, an open cabin, its doors swinging gently in the breeze, inviting him in. His blood ran cold. He knew deep down that once he stepped inside, there would be no turning back. The cabin's interior was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow outside. Lucas hesitated for a moment, his mind racing with fear and doubt. He could feel the presence of something waiting for him inside, something ancient and malevolent. His hands trembled as he gripped the edges of the doorframe, his knuckles white with tension. The whispers grew louder, their voices blending into a cacophony of sinister chants. "Enter. It's the only way," they urged. "She's inside waiting for you." Lucas took a deep breath and stepped inside. The moment he entered the cabin, the door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang, sealing him inside. The Ferris wheel lurched to life, and the cabin began to rise slowly into the air, creaking and groaning with every movement. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest as he looked out through the fogged windows. The park below seemed to dissolve into darkness, the ground falling away until it was nothing but an abyss of shadow. He was alone, trapped. Then the cabin began to change. At first, it was subtle, a shift in the air, a slight darkening of the walls. But then, the entire space warped, twisting and bending as if reality itself were unraveling. The walls stretched and pulsed, and the shadows in the corners grew darker, thicker, until they seemed to take on a life of their own. The whispers were deafening now, filling every inch of the cabin, echoing off the walls, growing into a terrible, discordant chorus. Suddenly, the shadows moved. They slithered along the floor, creeping up the walls, gathering in the center of the cabin. Lucas backed away, his breath quickening, but there was nowhere to go. The shadows writhed and coiled, merging together until they formed a single, monstrous shape, a figure cloaked in darkness, its eyes glowing with a sickly, unnatural light. The temperature in the cabin dropped, the air freezing, and Lucas could see his breath misting in front of him. The figure spoke, its voice a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down his spine. "You've come this far," it said, its voice echoing with malice. "But now you must face the truth." Lucas's mind raced. What truth? What did it mean? The figure moved closer, its shadowy form towering over him, filling the entire cabin with its oppressive presence. "You want to save her," it whispered, its voice dripping with mockery. "But you've already failed. You left her, and now she's mine." "No," Lucas whispered, shaking his head, his voice barely audible. I didn't leave her. I didn't." The figure's eyes glowed brighter, and the shadows swirled around it like a storm. "She was lost because of you," it hissed. "And now you will join her." Lucas's mind spiraled into chaos. The weight of his guilt, his fear, his failure, it all came crashing down on him. Was this true? Had he really been the one to abandon Anna? His memories were clouded, distorted by the park's influence, but the guilt gnawed at him like a ravenous beast. The figure loomed closer, its presence suffocating. "You have one choice," it growled. "Give yourself to me, or lose her forever." Lucas's heart pounded in his chest. This was it, the moment of truth. He had to make a decision: sacrifice himself to the darkness, or risk losing Anna forever. The cabin shook violently, the shadows pressing in from all sides, suffocating him, drowning him in fear. The figure waited, its glowing eyes locked on his, the weight of the choice crushing him. And then, with a deep, trembling breath, Lucas made his decision. The cabin trembled violently as the Ferris wheel carried Lucas higher, the oppressive darkness closing in from all sides. The figure in front of him, an embodiment of the park's malevolent force, stood towering, its glowing eyes locked on to his. The air was thick with the weight of his decision, and every breath felt like a struggle. The shadows writhed at the edges of the cabin, crawling along the walls and floor like tendrils of darkness, reaching for him, waiting for him to submit. The figure's voice was low, its tone dripping with malice, vibrating through Lucas's bones. "You can't fight this," it hissed. "You've already lost." Lucas felt the pressure of the choice hanging over him, the weight of his guilt almost unbearable. The visions had shown him a twisted version of his past, his failure to protect Anna, his inability to face the truth. But even now, as the shadows closed in, a flicker of resistance remained in his heart. He had come this far, fought this long, and he couldn't just give in. Not yet. The figure loomed closer, its presence suffocating. "Surrender to me," it growled, "or she will be lost forever." The cabin creaked and groaned as it rose higher, the grinding of the Ferris wheel's rusted metal echoing in Lucas's ears like the tolling of a funeral bell. His mind was a storm of emotions, fear, guilt, regret. But beneath it all, there was a faint spark of something else: defiance. He had been drawn into this nightmare, manipulated by the park and the entity that controlled it, but something deep inside him refused to accept that it was over. He had to find a way to fight back. The figure's glowing eyes narrowed, sensing his hesitation. "You think you can resist?" it snarled, its voice growing darker, more insidious. "You think you can save her? You are nothing, Lucas. You've always been nothing." The shadows surged forward, wrapping around Lucas's legs, their icy touch sending a shock of terror through him. He tried to pull away, but the darkness tightened its grip, pulling him closer to the entity's looming form. For a moment, panic took over. The shadows were everywhere now, writhing and pulsing, creeping up his body, sapping his strength. His vision blurred as the weight of the park's malevolent energy pressed down on him, threatening to crush him. The whispers in his mind grew louder, more frantic, urging him to give in, to let the darkness consume him. But in that moment of terror, a memory flashed before his eyes. Anna, laughing, her hand in his, as they ran through the park on that long-forgotten day. Her face was full of life, full of joy. That was the real Anna, not the twisted figure the park had shown him. Lucas gritted his teeth, summoning every ounce of willpower he had left. "You're wrong," he whispered, his voice shaking but resolute. "I'm not nothing, and I will save her." The figure's eyes flared with anger, the shadows around it churning like a storm. "Fool!" it spat, its voice a thunderous growl. "You cannot defy me. You belong to this place now. You will always belong to me." But Lucas wasn't listening anymore. His mind was clear now, sharper than it had been since he entered the park. The visions, the nightmares, the guilt, they had all been part of the entity's plan, a way to break him, to make him submit. But now, he saw the truth. The entity had no real power over him, only the power he gave it. And he wasn't going to give it anything. With a surge of adrenaline, Lucas tore himself free from the shadows, his body shaking with the effort. The darkness hissed and writhed, but he pushed forward, stepping closer to the figure, refusing to let it intimidate him. The figure's form flickered, as though it were losing its grip on reality, its glowing eyes dimming. "No!" it roared, its voice crackling with fury. "You cannot defeat me." Lucas ignored the entity's rage, his focus entirely on the glowing cabin high above. He could feel it. Anna was there, waiting, trapped in whatever twisted reality the park had created. And if he could reach her, if he could pull her back, they could escape this nightmare together. The Ferris wheel groaned as it continued to turn, the cabin swaying precariously in the wind. The park itself seemed to resist his every step, but Lucas pressed on, his determination fueling him. The figure in front of him lashed out, its shadowy tendrils snapping through the air like whips, trying to drag him back into the darkness. But Lucas was faster now, more focused. He dodged the attacks, his movements fluid, his mind sharp. The entity howled in frustration, its form flickering and distorting as it tried to maintain control. "You cannot save her," it snarled, its voice cracking with desperation. "She belongs to me." With a final surge of energy, Lucas lunged forward, grabbing onto the base of the Ferris wheel. His hands burned as the rusted metal cut into his skin, but he didn't care. He had to reach Anna. He began to climb, pulling himself up the side of the wheel as it continued to turn. The shadows swirled around him, lashing out at his legs and arms, but he fought through the pain, ignoring the dark voices that screamed in his mind. The higher he climbed, the more distant the figure's voice became, until it was nothing more than a fading echo in the back of his mind. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Lucas reached the glowing cabin. His arms ached, his body was trembling with exhaustion, but he didn't stop. He forced the door open, the metal hinges screeching in protest, and stepped inside. There, in the middle of the cabin, sat Anna. She was curled up in the corner, her eyes wide and empty, her body shaking with fear. But she was alive. Lucas felt a wave of relief wash over him as he knelt beside her, his voice soft and trembling. "Anna, it's me. I'm here. We're going to get out of here." She looked up at him, her eyes filled with tears, but there was something else in her gaze, something fragile and hopeful. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Is it really you?" "It's me," he said, his heart aching. "I'm going to get us out of here." But as he reached for her, the shadows inside the cabin surged, swirling around them both, pulling at their limbs. The figure's voice echoed through the cabin, louder now, filled with rage and desperation. "You cannot take her," it roared. "She is mine." Lucas gritted his teeth, holding on to Anna with all his strength. "No," he whispered, his voice filled with defiance. "She belongs with me." The shadows writhed, the cabin shaking violently as the entity fought to pull them both into the darkness. But Lucas refused to let go. He held on to Anna, his heart pounding with fear and determination, and together they fought against the pull of the park's malevolent force. The cabin shuddered, the Ferris wheel groaned, and the shadows screamed in fury. But Lucas didn't stop. He wouldn't stop. With one final, desperate push, Lucas pulled Anna out of the cabin and onto the Ferris wheel's frame. The moment they stepped into the open air, the shadows shrieked and recoiled, their grip on reality finally breaking. The park trembled, the fog dissipating, and the figure's voice faded into nothingness. They were free. The park had fallen into an unnatural stillness, the once howling wind reduced to a faint whisper, as if the very air held its breath. Lucas and Anna stood at the base of the Ferris wheel, their legs trembling from exhaustion, their bodies weak from the struggle. The oppressive fog that had choked the park for so long was now thinning, revealing the twisted remnants of rusted rides and dilapidated structures. But something about the silence felt wrong, too final. The entity's voice had vanished, and the shadows no longer crawled with malicious intent, but the tension lingered, hanging heavy in the air like the aftermath of a storm that was far from over. Lucas held Anna close, his heart still racing from their escape. Her eyes, once wide with terror, were now empty, lost in a daze, as if part of her was still trapped in that shadowy nightmare. She didn't speak, but her trembling hands gripped his shirt, clinging to him like a lifeline. He whispered her name softly, trying to reassure her that they were free, that it was over. But as the words left his mouth, a nagging doubt crept into his mind. Was it truly over? Could something so ancient, so powerful, be defeated so easily? They began to walk slowly through the park, navigating the skeletal remains of what had once been a place of joy. The ground beneath them felt uneven, shifting as if the earth itself were unstable, like it hadn't fully settled after the nightmare they had just endured. As they passed by the broken rides, Lucas's eyes darted to the shadows that clung to the corners of the park, darker and more still than they should have been. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching them. Though the entity's voice had faded, its presence seemed to linger just beyond sight, hiding in the cracks of reality. The air grew colder, despite the thinning fog, and every step they took felt heavier. Lucas glanced over his shoulder, his breath catching in his throat as he saw the Ferris wheel in the distance, now standing motionless. Its once ominous movement ceased. But even from far away, he could feel its eyes on him, as if it were waiting, biding its time. The thought sent a shiver down his spine, and he quickened his pace, guiding Anna through the decaying remnants of the park, desperate to find a way out, a way back to the real world. But the exit didn't come. The further they walked, the more the park seemed to stretch, its pathways winding into unfamiliar territory. Lucas's frustration grew as he realized they were lost, trapped in the labyrinth of twisted rides and fog-shrouded alleys. He tried to shake the feeling of unease, telling himself that the park was just a physical place now no longer under the control of the entity. Yet, no matter how much he tried to believe it, the creeping sense of dread refused to leave him. Then, from behind them, a faint sound echoed, something metallic, something familiar. Lucas stopped in his tracks, his blood running cold as he turned toward the source. It was faint at first, barely audible through the silence, but it grew louder, a slow, methodical creaking. The Ferris wheel, far in the distance, had begun to move again. Lucas's heart dropped. He watched as the great metal wheel turned, slowly, impossibly, its cabins swaying in the cold breeze. Anna stiffened beside him, her grip on his arm tightening as she stared at the Ferris wheel, her face pale and expressionless. "Lucas," she whispered, her voice hollow. "It's not over." He didn't want to believe her. He couldn't. But the evidence was right there, staring back at him from the shadows of the park. The Ferris wheel turned, its movement slow, deliberate, and with every groan of its rusted joints, Lucas felt the weight of its gaze pressing down on him. It was as if the park was alive again, not with the same violent malice as before, but with something far more insidious, a quiet, patient evil that was content to wait. They moved faster now, stumbling through the twisted paths, but no matter how far they ran, the park seemed endless, the exit always just out of reach. The familiar rides, the carousel, the roller coaster, appeared again and again, as if they were walking in circles, trapped in a loop. The creaking of the Ferris wheel followed them, a constant reminder that the park's dark presence had not been defeated, only subdued, lurking in the background, waiting for its chance to reclaim them. Lucas's breath came in ragged gasps, his body aching from the exertion. "We need to get out," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to Anna. But every corner they turned, every pathway they followed, led them deeper into the park's maze. It was as if the park had shifted, no longer a mere physical space, but a reflection of their fears, their guilt, their unresolved nightmares. Then, without warning, the fog thickened again, rolling in from the far edges of the park, swallowing the pathways and obscuring their view. Lucas's heart pounded in his chest, the familiar weight of dread pressing down on him. He looked to Anna, her face pale and blank, her eyes distant. "We can't let it take us again," he said, gripping her hand tightly. But she didn't respond. Instead, her gaze drifted toward the Ferris wheel in the distance, as if something unseen was calling her back. Lucas pulled her forward, fighting against the fog, but it was everywhere now, closing in around them. The shadows moved once more, flickering at the edges of his vision, and with them came the whispers, soft at first, then louder, growing into a chorus of voices, all speaking in unison. "You cannot escape. You belong to us." His pulse quickened, the weight of the voices pressing into his mind. He shook his head, trying to block them out, but they were everywhere, surrounding him, filling the park, filling his thoughts. He stumbled, his knees weak, but he refused to stop, refused to give in. "We have to keep moving," he said, his voice hoarse, but even as he spoke the words, he knew it was useless. The park had them now. As they pushed forward, the fog thickened further, and the whispers grew deafening, swirling around them like a storm. Lucas felt the ground beneath him shift, as if the very earth were crumbling beneath his feet. And then, in the distance, through the thick veil of mist, he saw it. The Ferris wheel, turning slowly, its cabin swaying, each one filled with shadows, waiting, watching. The realization hit him like a cold wave. They hadn't escaped. The park had simply let them believe they had, allowed them a brief moment of hope before pulling them back into its grasp. It was a game, a cruel game, and now it was starting all over again. Lucas's breath hitched as he looked at Anna, her face still expressionless, her eyes locked on the Ferris wheel. "It's not over," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It will never be over." And in that moment, Lucas understood. The park wasn't just a place. It was a living nightmare, a reflection of their deepest fears and regrets. It had no end, no escape. It would always be waiting, lurking in the shadows, ready to pull them back into its clutches whenever it chose. They could run, they could fight, but the truth was inescapable. The park had claimed them, and no matter how far they went, it would always be there, a part of them now.